Hello, my friends. Welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm your host, Joanna LaFleur, and you're watching the YouTube version of the podcast. Week after week, we're coming at you with conversations with creatives and communicators all about how to communicate the best news in the world, but in the digital age. Thanks so much for watching, checking out this episode. If you want to know more, you want to check out more of our free resources, go to wordmadedigital.com or browse around this YouTube channel and you're definitely going to find some content that will help you. And of course, thank you so much to our sponsors, Compassion Canada and Wycliffe College are making this podcast possible. Enjoy the interview. Grace P. Cho, welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm really glad to have you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
I am not going to lie, a bit jealous of, you say you're near Disneyland, which is a magical place, and I would love to go, but it's closed right now.
It is. And I love that you think it's magical because not everyone thinks that. And I think it's magical. I know it's not that way for everyone. So thank you for understanding that.
Well, hey, before we, today we want to talk about your world and your passions. You're an editor, and
Yes.
you are also, particularly, we want to talk today about a new book that you've edited. And I happen to know one of the authors personally that's involved in it, a Canadian woman down the road. And anyways, we want to get to the book about
Yes.
Take Heart. It's about when life's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll meander our way there through a few different things. So before we do that, can you introduce yourself a little bit, give us some context of who you are?
Sure. I am a Korean American writer and editor. I also would say that I'm a speaker, and newly I'm adding poet to that list. I don't feel quite comfortable saying that, but I think this year actually has been a year of exploration in my creativity. And so I'm very sheepishly adding poet to my repertoire.
Oh, I love that. I mean, on your personal site, you have some of your poetry, you have some of your work.
I
So,
do.
okay, let's start there. Tell me, because now you're saying it, you say sheepishly.
Mhm.
Why does that feel, what's sort of the nervousness around calling yourself a poet?
Well, I think my whole writing journey has been one where I think, I don't know about anyone else, but a lot of writers I know had stories where they had their second grade teacher tell them, you should be a writer one day, or had their parents really invest in them. And I never really had any of those experiences. Academically, in terms of writing, I wasn't very good. So all the way until grad school, I despised essays. I despised writing in long form. And so it was to even call myself a writer, that took several years. I used to say, I just write on the side. I used to work as a pastor, and so I did write on the side. But to step into that fully, that felt uncomfortable. And I used to say that sheepishly. And now I feel the same way about calling myself a poet. I never had training, or I never explored it much. And I thought that was a silly thing inside me. I'm not a poet. I don't have, I'm not good at rhyming, or I'm not good at thinking of words on the spot, or any of those thoughts that tell me that I'm being an imposter to call myself a poet. And so now I'm trying to say it and practice saying the words in order to make it become real, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think I would imagine there's a level of vulnerability in poetry that is because it's less straightforward maybe than a
Right.
typical written. And so maybe just more vulnerable to critique, or like people thinking you're a bad poet, where maybe an essay is a little harder to say you're bad at writing.
I haven't thought of that, but the critic in my head tells me, who am I to even call myself that? And particularly thinking of not anyone specific, but who would say, she's not creative enough, or who does she think she is to all of a sudden call herself that when she doesn't have the experience, or she's never written in that form before, or anything like that. I'm assuming other people, other creatives especially, must feel that way when they venture into something new. And so, yeah, I'm practicing. I'm practicing calling myself what I want to be so that I could be better at it.
And there's something about, I love that. I know a lot of women, especially
Mm-hmm.
who are wanting to be speakers, or have a more public kind of, I mean, a voice in writing or a voice in
Mm-hmm.
speaking. I think for women, especially, I've heard over and over that it feels like you're not supposed to say that. Uh,
Right.
and so then you don't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You've been doing it for a while, but you're nervous to call you. I know a woman who is a professional full-time speaker, in her, I think she's in her 50s,
Mm-hmm.
and she for years avoided calling herself a speaker or a Bible teacher because she
Mm-hmm.
just was shirking the weight of the word or something, and what
Right.
it.
I also wonder if it sounds like we're being arrogant to call ourselves that, because show me your qualifications, show me why you deserve that title. And I think a lot of women do feel that way, not just in the creative world, but in every sphere. It's hard to call ourselves something, or to even elevate ourselves and say, this is who I am, and showing up fully as that, because the world hasn't always been kind to women in that way, or they haven't been very encouraging in that way.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, and I mean, not like a fair statement.
Mm-hmm.
One of the main really hearts of why when I found you,
Mm-hmm.
discovered who you were, I saw in your website this line that says you have a heart for women of color's voices being elevated in the publishing world.
Yes.
So not just women, but women of color.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like, when I saw that line, I was like, I need to talk to Grace Peacho. Because I need to get into this story with you, because
Mm-hmm.
uh, I'm a white woman, and so there's certainly things about a woman, like as we just discussed, maybe there's some challenges,
Yes.
but not a woman of color.
Right.
And so I was very intrigued at this idea of learning from you, what's missing, what's the difference, and particularly even in that, is that even a further barrier to naming who you are and what you do? So just let's
Oh,
start
wow.
opening that
Yeah.
conversation a little bit. I'd love to know more about why you're so passionate about
Mm-hmm.
serving this group of people.
I'll connect it to my own story about coming into this writing world, and even my first experience of blogging and going into the blogging world. I think maybe it's not as prominent now, but when I first started writing a couple of years ago, there were a lot of blogging conferences. And when I went to my first one, and my only one, I didn't realize the world I was stepping into. So I grew up in a predominantly Asian American setting. I'm also the daughter of missionaries and pastors, so I grew up overseas.
What country or what
Oh, I
area?
grew up in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I have a brother in Central Asia.
I love all these connections that we have. So I remember walking into the big hall where we were all meeting for the first time, and recognizing that I was, I think, one of three Asian American women that I saw. And I wasn't prepared for that after
And this
having
is a room of 1,000 people or something, or hundreds of people.
hundreds. I would say hundreds. Yeah. Um, and that, I don't know why I was so taken aback, but maybe because I was stepping into something new, and I wasn't exposed as much. Maybe that's why. So stepping into a room full of women who didn't look like me, um, made me realize maybe this isn't the world for me. But I couldn't shake the call to write, and so I just kept going. And over time, I realized that my cultural identity journey, along with my writing journey, they kind of happened at the same time. So I mentioned before, I'm Korean American, but for most of my life, I really hated for most of my teenage years and up, I really despised my Korean Americanness because I felt very othered by my cultural identity and the fact that I'm still being asked, where are you really from? Or being asked if I know my mother tongue, and for shame that I don't know my mother tongue as well as I should, or that I'm not raising my kids to speak Korean and being shamed by that by random strangers.
Really?
Yes, and
That's
so
no, that's interesting. Even the language that there's sort of a judgment on, not just that. I hear that question is I hear that people get asked that question, where are you from or where are you
hmm
really
hmm
from? I know I'm from California, but
exactly
the question of language is even
right.
judged, huh?
Yeah, and it comes from both sides. It comes from Korean adults who immigrated here, and they want us, the next generation, to hold on to uh, the things that tie us together, and predominantly our language, and but also being shamed by people who are not Korean and maybe have visited Korea or lived in Korea or served in Korea during a war, and being shamed that I don't represent well. So on both sides, I'm being shamed for not being an ideal Korean American, whatever that even means. Um, so that cultural identity journey was overlapped by my writing journey, and so understanding how to have a voice and what my voice sounds like took a couple years. um, and as I stepped further into the writing world, particularly as the editor at Encourage, um, I noticed, and I've walked with a lot of friends who've written books and women of color who've written books, and seeing our experiences and how we're one of very few again. It's like walking into that room, and seeing, oh, okay, I see you, one, two other Asian American women.
And
And
was it literally like you might make eye contact, you kind of like a knowing nod across the room, or
um,
there's
you know,
acknowledgement, silent acknowledgement of some kind?
I feel like it's we're not even matching our eyes because we're
Hmm.
just in our own spaces, and we at the time for me it was a I didn't even want to acknowledge that I don't belong here. So looking at that person and matching eyes meant, for me, and this is not everyone's experience, but for me, it felt like we're both acknowledging the elephant in the room, and I don't want to do that, because that felt like we don't belong then. So, and so I've noticed this of not only as authors and writers that there's a lack of voices represented, and also hearing that if we're a person of color, a writer of color, that there are only certain things we should write. So having, in lots of conversations about racial justice or racial reconciliation, maybe that's what they would want us to write. Not about memoir, not about motherhood, not about anything else. But when it comes to that, if they're looking for writers of color, and they meaning publishers, they might
Mm.
be looking for people who only want to talk about that. So I've seen that with my own eyes. I've seen how we've been um, pushed into a corner sometimes of like, this is what we want you to write about, and then also seeing the lack of diversity within the publishing industry, and how that actually affects writers. So when you write a book, it takes maybe 2 years, average, to get it published. But in that time, after you even submit your manuscript, it goes into the hands of editors, lots of editors, and marketers and publicists. And if you're a writer of color and it gets handed off to someone who is not aware of cultural differences or nuances, particularly, then it's not going to be understood. So
Hmm.
I've noticed how things are changed. Even as an editor, my job is to know the writer's voice well enough, to know their story well enough so that I can edit accordingly, right? I'm not trying to make them sound like me. I'm trying to make them sound like a better them. Um,
Yes, right.
and so when the editor doesn't know the author or writer, and because it goes through so many hands before it gets to the end, I've just seen how sometimes it gets washed over. Sometimes language, certain um, nuance of words are taken out or
Mm.
changed, or can you go back and fix
Sound more
this?
white or something.
Or maybe just not even understanding the cultural context of why this person wrote the way they did, or what is this pain that I'm experiencing. And if you don't understand that pain, then you want to correct it. And I think that's
Mm.
natural. I think that's human nature. When you don't understand something, you're trying to put it into the context that you know. And that's tricky as an editor because I'm sure as an editor in a publishing company, you have to go through so many books. So
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone has that capacity to do that, but I have seen white editors who are aware, who have done some of the work of at least learning about racism and the construct of whiteness, and having those eyes being able to edit and work on a book that honors the original author's voice and experiences. So I think that's where it really came from, is seeing the tension and seeing the lack of women of color on all sides of the book industry. So not only authors, but editors, publicists, um, marketers, even graphic designers, and knowing uh, the artistic side of what that means.
Right.
So
Wow.
there's so many things about that I have a heart for, and I'm not saying like we should, blow up this whole system. I don't think that's how it works, and sometimes that might be the way people want to go about it, and that's okay. That's their thing. But what I really want to see are women of color on all sides and in all different positions, and particularly positions that allow other women of color to come in too. And that's my heart, is I want to become an editor and a writer that allows the doors to open up for other women of color, because we're not heard. And
Hmm.
my biggest pet peeve is not only when we're not heard, but when someone else goes and tells our story in their voice. I have a
Right.
really hard
Wow.
time with that. And I know there might be exceptions that people think are okay, but personally, I find that very hard when we're not even given the space or the platform to tell stories in our own voice, and then someone to come in and tell stories that are ours. Um, so yeah, that's my big spiel about why I'm passionate about that and why I want to see that happen more.
Hmm.
Maybe even through me as
Yes.
I
Yes.
continue to work in this industry. Yeah.
Oh, I have so many questions. I'm trying to decide which one to ask first. But one of the things that it reminds me of, um, in the film world,
Mm.
is about less about women of color, but more women in general. Is that I think it's called the Bechtel test, which is the gist is basically a film has to pass this test. It has to have two women characters
Mm.
who are having a conversation in the film that is not about men that they
Mm.
are interested in dating or
Mm-hmm.
being romantic with. I mean, I'm butchering it, but if people have heard about this before, you can look it up. But this is basically a study that shows that like there are very, very few movies that exist in out of Hollywood that show women as interesting, diverse
Mm.
characters with lives, thoughts, and feelings of their own that aren't in relation to the men of the film. And
Mm-hmm.
so ultimately what the study is trying to say is that when men control what gets produced in film, these are the kinds of films that are created. They're
Right.
male centric films. And in the same way that I'm just trying to imagine that in the same way, if the publishing world is predominantly a white industry in
Mm-hmm.
America,
Mm-hmm.
then the stories that are told and the angle from which they are told is through, or maybe I should say the filters. It sounds like what you're
Mm-hmm.
describing as filters continue to be white. So, what do we, what do we do about, as you say, like the machine that a book goes through,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is many filters of editing and marketing. There's a whole business
Right.
team that's involved in
Yes.
getting a book out the door. So, should people self-publish? Forget this industry. We can do it ourselves. Go on Amazon. Like
Right.
what do we do? How do we hear more
That's a good,
voices?
it's a good question. How do we get voices out when
Yeah.
the bigger industry has a lot of gatekeepers or has a lot of filters through which they choose certain people of color, or certain writers of color? And I don't know. That's the real answer is I wonder when when it'll shift. And I think that's why we need all types of publishing to happen. So if an author feels like the traditional route is not fast enough or um, is not allowing me to be fully myself, then definitely go the route that you can. Um, I wish it was all of it. I know that's such a generic answer, but I wish there was a push and a wave in all ways. So if people want to self-publish, like, please go do that so your book can get out there. Or if they really want to go the traditional route, please let's have people in there who can understand um, and who can elevate and push for your book and advocate for your book with on the business side, on the inside of the company. But again, that takes time, right? So I'm not saying that white editors and publicists and marketers can't do the advocacy too. I'm just saying that when you have a different perspective at the table where decisions are made, it affects the decisions that are made, because
Yes.
someone is finally saying something else and bringing a perspective that no one even could have imagined or thought of. And so I know that that route will take a lot longer. And so I wish for all the avenues to be opened up for writers of color. And it also goes back to even writing itself is a privileged work. To have a computer, to have internet, to write and have the time to do that, it's a privileged work. So I understand there's so many barriers to us being published and heard. And so I wish that it was made easier,
Mm.
instead of having more obstacles, because we already have obstacles. How can we make the road smoother for writers of color to be heard and to be published, and seen as valid in their own right, and not
Yeah.
because they are, like you said with that test, are they just passing the minimum, very bare minimum that the publishing company requires,
Mm.
or what they want to hear from people of color? Can people of color, writers of color, show up fully as themselves and still um, be seen as, be accepted? Can their manuscripts still be accepted as they are? So it's a very nuanced conversation, and I think there are lots of perspectives to it. But I wish the floodgates would just open up for as many voices to be heard. Yeah.
Yes. And so we're sort of dancing around the work you do as an editor, or you're
Mm-hmm.
speaking around it, but not specifically for us who are less familiar with the industry. Um, but we would dream of being a writer. There's
Okay.
probably people listening who they got a book in them. They're gonna want to find an editor one day. Can you tell us what does an editor actually do for you? I mean, besides like they edit the book, but like, can you tell us what does an editor do? But then also, how would you find a match? Like, what would you suggest to people if they need an editor? If there's
Right.
a list of 100, how would you suggest you find someone who is the right fit for you?
There's a lot of ways I can answer that question, but I think it comes back to, what do you need as a writer, right? So if you're a new writer and you're just looking for someone to make your work better, um, instead of hiring an editor for yourself, because it can be a lot of money, I would suggest a peer edit. So like joining a writing group or gathering a group of friends that write together, and having that kind of, basically creating a community around this idea of writing together, and therefore um, you get free feedback in essence. Now, if you're wanting to go into the publishing world, I think there are different levels, or different roles that editors play. And I don't work for a publishing company. And so I can only speak from my experience as an editorial manager at Encourage. We have guest submissions that we accept every quarter. So that's one way that you can get a foot into the door for other people and a larger audience to read your work. And I know a lot of, online publications do this where they accept guest submissions. And so that's one step I would say is it's not a direct edit, but it's just a way to practice your writing. Now, in the publishing world, an acquisitions editor would come and find you, or you would go and seek out, maybe through an agent. I heard it's very difficult if you try to do it yourself, because they may not accept anything but from an agent. So submitting your book proposal to a publishing company, and that would go through the acquisitions editor whose job is to scout for new writers and authors for their company to acquire. So it all depends on what you need and what step you are on in the journey.
And so then when you find the right editor, what do they do beyond just like they're checking the spelling and the grammar?
Right.
What is sort of what is an edit? What are you editing?
I'll just explain when I, not in the guest submissions, because when you submit to us, we want like a pretty well done post by you already.
Or polished. Yeah.
Pretty polished. But for our regular team of, I think we're at 26 writers. I work on both. Yes, the basic grammar, punctuation, those things. I do that too. But really I'm looking for developmental. Like, does this story flow the way it's written currently? Does it make sense the way it's flowing? Is there movement in the story and also a good, strong takeaway? Because all of our posts have a personal story and then the takeaway that we want the reader to walk away with. And so I feel like that's like the bigger part of my job is, does the story and the takeaway work all together? Is it structurally sound? Can it stand on its own, or does it need a little bit of help? Do some paragraphs need to be switched around because the story is not quite making sense the way it's written? And it probably made sense to the writer when they're writing it, because when you're in the thick of it, you can't see. And that's why a writer comes in and comes from the outside and says, hey, I'm looking at this with fresh eyes, and I just want to show you how perhaps these changes can help guide the reader. Because I think that's what we're doing as writers. We're trying to guide the reader from one point to another, from understanding this thing to the next thing. And so that's our job as editors, is to make their work excellent in their voice. Yeah.
Yes. And you say in your own work, this idea and that storytelling can change the world.
Yes.
So, I mean, as an editor, you're trying to tell a better story.
Yes.
But why story? Like, what is it about? Why does that change the world, or how could that change the world? I mean,
growing up, I felt like the books I read opened up a whole new world for me. And I think that gives us an imagination we might not have in the context that we're in. And I think that's why it can change our lives and therefore create movements that change the world. And so books are like a magical portal through which people can experience new things, but also to see, like, could we create a better world for ourselves? Could we imagine that this is what people feel and experience, even though that has not been my experience? And can we feel empathy for that? So it's just so powerful when we tell a personal story, how it can impact the listener and the reader, and how that change in that person can therefore create in the way that they talk about it, in the way that they reshare the story, it can expand in such a way that changes the world. And so Yeah, I think that's why we tell our stories. And, before we had the written word, we had a lot of oral stories. And I think we've lost a little bit of that in
Hmm.
our current digital world, but that we can regain that um, via the digital world by sharing on the internet. And then the whole world can read it.
So this this book, this most recently published by Encourage, it's
Hmm.
called Take Heart: 100 Devotions to Seeing God When Life's Not Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that, like when life's not okay,
Yes.
but as to get us there, as you're a storyteller yourself, you're not just the editor, but you're a contributor to
Hmm.
this work. What was it like for you, as a Korean American woman, to see your part in this book? Well, what did it mean to you to have your name in this book?
When I finished the project, and I think a lot of creatives might relate to this, when you finish a project, you're just so happy it's done. So I,
Yeah.
I, I don't think I imagined the moment when I would hold the book in my hands.
Mm,
And because this isn't a solo book, it's a contributor book. Um, I just didn't think much of it, that um, it would still have my name on the title page. So when I opened it for the first time and saw my name, I got emotional. I started crying because
mm,
I had not grown up seeing Korean American authors on the books I read. So whether as authors or even as illustrators, um,
right.
so seeing my own name there and also having my kids be so excited to see my name and go through and find the devotions that I wrote, that it was as if I came out of my body and watched something happen that I never got to experience, which is seeing myself reflected on um, the page, and how
Right.
powerful that
Wow.
is when we see ourselves represented, even just by name. Just knowing, looking at the last name Cho and knowing that's a Korean name, and that means a Korean person held this book, held the words, and made an impact in that way. So that was more meaningful to me than I had expected it to be. Um, and even just watching my kids flip through the book, it healed something inside me, a wound I didn't realize I had. Um, but yeah, I was there.
Wow. Well, and the topic of the book
Mm-hmm.
is, about things aren't going good. Where's God?
So perfect
So,
for this year.
um, was this planned before 20? Did this come together in 2020, or was this something on the
No.
docket in 2018, and all of a sudden, I don't know. I mean, I
Yes.
don't know how far in advance it was worked on, but oh
Um,
my goodness.
I mean, it gives me chills to think that we had no idea that in October 2020, when this book came out, we would be where we're at, not just in America, but globally, and how life really isn't. I mean, life is not okay so many times in our lives, not just in 2020. So we could not have planned this. It was not by our doing necessarily. We were already going to write this book, regardless of the kind of year we were going to have. And obviously, none of us had an idea of what kind of year we would have. But so it feels very providential that it landed where it
Yeah.
did. Um, and even, I was thinking, I mean, it could have come out in March 2020, let's say. And maybe it would have felt like, yeah, we need that, but maybe not as deeply and desperately as we need to know that it's okay when life's not okay. When we were, 7 months into this pandemic, and all the hardships that this year has brought, and all the loss that this year has brought, and so it's been a really meaningful time to hear people tell us that these stories help them know um, they
Yeah.
can see God even in really, really hard times. And even when it feels like there's no hope, that God is still present. So I'm very proud of this book and proud of the words that we put together.
Well, and what I love too about books like this that are compilations, as you say, first of all, representation of multiple voices
Yes.
means that we will find ourselves in the book because it's not just one person's voice or
Mm-hmm.
perspective. But further to that, I think what I like about compilations is as an ADHD kind of person who is like, I need something to like, I need to
Mm-hmm.
be encouraged, or I need some truth from scripture today, or I need, but like, I'm distracted, I'm busy,
Mm-hmm.
grab the book. Like it's kind
Yeah,
of, it's like a to-go box
I love that.
of truth, of
Mm-hmm.
encouragement,
Mm-hmm.
of wisdom, as
Yeah,
opposed to sometimes a full piece. It's just more than I can do, or even more than I have time for, or
right.
just more than when you're overwhelmed, the
Mm-hmm.
last thing you need is like, here's 300 pages on the topic. It's like, I just need like 2 pages or maybe four.
And I feel like, isn't that when we want stories the most? I wrote in
Mm,
the introduction that stories create space for us to be known, to be understood, and I think that's why stories are so powerful, and that's why the stories in this book particularly um, can just create space for the readers to come and rest and be understood, and not have to fix themselves, even approaching this book. You can just come as you are and know that others have experienced similar things, or understand your pain, even if we haven't experienced the very same
yeah.
thing.
Wow. Yeah. Um, so the last question I have for you is, because you wrote about this, I wouldn't have thought to ask you about this,
Mm-hmm.
but you wrote about an article on your own site around being Asian American in the midst of COVID-19. So
Right.
in the midst of the craziness of things not being okay, oh, also
Mm-hmm.
maybe because of how I look, I'm a target
Yes.
for people's anger or something in my country about COVID.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because, like, that's not, like, we're talking about life's not okay. Like, that's not okay. So,
Right.
what has been your experience with that? Can you share a little bit about what you wrote?
Sure. I believe I wrote it. It showed up on Encourage. So I'm very proud of the work that Encourage and Dayspring has done um, to not only allow but welcome the stories of all our writers and all our experiences, and saying that they back us on that, that they
Mm.
support us, and that they see us,
And they
um,
believe you.
that they believe. Oh my gosh, yes, that they believe our experiences. And I think that's the hardest thing. Anytime someone's going through pain and someone else comes in and tries to explain it away, that's being so we're invisible, and
Mm.
we're already unheard. And so to have that belief in us is so huge. And Encourage and Dayspring has been a big. They've made that central to their work, and so I appreciate that. But my experience of being Asian American, and I think I tell the story of going to a gas station, and this was during maybe March, when things started getting more serious here in the States. And there was a man who pulled up behind me, um, who looked at me a strange way, and then proceeded to go back in his car. And I saw his car go around and go to a different pump at the same gas station. And I
Mm.
thought, what was he thinking that he
Right.
had to go away from me? Because there was no other reason. Someone else came up to that same pump after he left, and it was working fine. So it wasn't that the pump wasn't working. It
Mm.
was that he took a look at me and decided somewhere in himself that I'm not safe because of the way that she looks.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
and I was afraid, to walk with my kids around the neighborhood, because I wasn't quite sure how people would react to us um, when the way people are talking about the virus was in relation to it coming from China, and how many times in my life I've been called Chinese, even though I'm not. So
Yeah.
people making judgments about me, and assuming things about me because of the way I look. I know that's not only an Asian American experience, um, but being othered in that way is so painful. And also, it caused a lot of fear. And I don't know if you read that story. There was a family who went to Sam's Club, and someone came and slashed their faces. And yeah. They're
What?
kids. They're kids.
What?
I know.
No, I don't know. Oh God, I
It
don't know.
was when I read it, I thought that that's what I'm afraid of is that people are gonna assume things about me and my family,
Hmm.
um, and the rise of anti-Asian racism that has happened during this pandemic has been painful to watch. And so, not only that, but even hearing elderly people getting attacked, and
Wow.
that is never an okay thing. And
Yikes.
it's never okay that we make um, someone a target because of the color of their skin or because of the way they look or any of that. And so it's been a fearful experience as someone who has anxiety, or who struggles with anxiety, I should say, um, and who already has. As a mother, I think I just fear for my kids all the time. So to have that heightened sense of, are my kids even safe in our neighborhood? And nothing has happened in our neighborhood, but that experience at the gas station was so subtle, and it was where we always go to get gas, so it felt like, no, this is our home place, this is where we get gas, this is where we go shopping, and yet I'm not safe in these places. I'm not safe. Maybe this person didn't attack me, obviously, even with his words, but I'm not safe from the mentality he had, that I am a danger to him,
Hmm.
even though I don't have the virus and I am not the virus. But he made that assumption in that look he made, or he gave me. So, um, and I know a lot of people have felt discriminated, particularly Asian Americans, during the pandemic. And um, yeah, it's painful, and
Yeah.
I think it makes a difference how we use our language, the use of our words, and how we refer to things. It's so important that we're careful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's because words matter. You're
Yes.
an editor, and because we need to take heart right
Mm,
now.
yeah.
This book was put together. So, where can people find more of you? I think people are going to want to get more of you and your thinking, your perspective, and this book. Where do you want to send people today?
Sure. For me, you can go to gracepetro.com. I'm also Grace Petro on all platforms. And for the book, I believe you can buy it wherever books are sold. Dayspring.com has it. And also Dayspring.com has the Take Heart journal that comes with it, the prayer journal. So you can get that as a set, or you can get them separately. But I know you can find it on Amazon and Target. I've seen it at Target. Yeah, I've seen it on various sites. So wherever books are sold.
I got to tell you one thing about the pandemic that us Canadians are missing is Target,
Oh, I'm
because we
sorry.
can't cross the border right now. And I usually go to Target as often as I can be in America, but it's fine.
It's fine. Don't go to
But I can go on
Target.
Amazon, so it's fine.
There you go.
Grace, thank you so much for your openness, for sharing your story, or a few of them, anyways, a glimpse
Yeah.
into your story today, and for your work, um, helping others share theirs as you edit their work, and just inspire more people who are listening and want
Mm.
to write, or are writers, and are people of color, or women who are trying to bring their perspective to the world. Just thank you for your work, and I'm just glad to do this conversation with you today.
Thank you.